Hello, welcome to the Positive Posting Conversation, the show about how to have a better relationship with your dog and cat. I'm Zazie Todd, author of the books Bark, Wag and Purr, and creator of companion animal psychology blog. My co-host, Kristi Benson, is a dog trainer and anthropologist, and she also works at the Academy for Dog Trainers. We can't give advice on your pet, so if you have concerns, see your dog trainer, cat behaviourist, or veterinarian as appropriate. Thanks for joining us today. We all love dogs and cats, but there are some animals that most of us really don't like or feel squeamish about. Is this reaction actually irrational? Do those animals play an important role after all? And should we really be falling in love with them? We're going to find out today from Jo Wimpenny, author of Beauty of the Beasts, which is just out now. Welcome to the Positive Post in Conversation. I'm Zazie Todd. I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host Kristi Benson. Hey, Kristi, when we spoke to Jo last, which was for our holiday special, you mentioned that you really don't like ants. Is that the main animal that you dislike, or are there others too?
It's kind of a tough question because I feel like in our domain, there's a bit of like moralizing if you have an animal that you don't like. Like there's a little bit of judgment involved. So, but I've gone on record saying, ants are not, they don't really do it for me. So I'm going to stick with that.
Fair enough. I find ants quite fascinating, but there are other animals that I don't like. Mosquitoes is definitely one of them because they unfortunately love me. So we're going to talk about all different kinds of animals today with Jo Wimpenny. Jo is a zoologist and writer with a research background in animal behaviour and the history of science. She studied zoology at the University of Bristol, and she went on to research problem solving in crows for her DPhil at Oxford, which is so cool. She's the author of Aesop's Animals, which we've spoken to her about before. And her new book, which is just out now, is Beauty of the Beasts, Rethinking Nature's Least Loved Animals. Thank you for joining us today, Jo.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me back.
Please, will you just hold up the beautiful cover of your book so that we can all see it? Because my copy is still on its way to me and hasn't arrived yet. And I think everyone should see that this is an absolutely gorgeous cover. It's purpley and it's got this giant yellowy orangey wasp on it. It's absolutely beautiful cover. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming to tell us about it. And we first heard about it in our holiday episode when it was very exciting that you told us it was coming, and we loved hearing about it. So why did you decide to write about beasties?
Yes, the beasties. I mean, simply put, it's my call to action for people to appreciate a much broader diversity of animal life on this planet. So in Aesop's Animals, I was using Aesop's fables as kind of the hook to tell stories about animal cognition research. But the more that I was looking into it, the more I was learning about the human-animal relationship and how irrational this can sometimes be, and how it's strongly based on cultural references, of course. But in Beauty of the Beasts, I wanted to delve into this a bit more, and to look at kind of the biology that shapes our emotional responses also to certain groups of animals, and to focus on the animals people don't like. And the main reason for this is simply that we're living in this time where we're losing so many species at such an alarming rate, many of whom we understand, we don't know enough about, and just a really small proportion of animal life is deemed to be worthy by lots of people. We support them based on perhaps their looks, or their harmlessness, or their resemblance to us in some way. But there's so much more in the animal kingdom that we're not supporting, or that we're actively demonizing. And so I really wanted to look into that, and to find out why we have these responses to certain animals, and then to shine a light on what these animals are actually like. There's great evidence coming from animal behaviour and cognition research, showing that some of these creatures are incredibly good at problem solving, or they experience emotional responses. They have complex inner lives, and they're much more sentient than we think. And also ecologically, some of them are absolute superstars, and the world just wouldn't function without them. And so my aim was really to bring all of this to life and hopefully create a little bit of friction among people that read it. So they're a little bit less likely to reach for the bug spray or, the rat poison next time they see one of these creatures in what they think is their space.
I think it's interesting hearing, I always love reading about animals and animal, like when they have like cultural responses to things and they're passing on information. I find it all very fascinating. And it really helps to inform my work. I do a lot of work, I think I mentioned this before, in the species at risk sort of zone. And some of the conversations that we've been having in the species at risk area is about protecting habitats and sort of protecting ecologies rather than singling out a specific animal. And I think that that's a really interesting way to look at it. And because I come from working for an Indigenous government, and there's definitely a more holistic sort of approach to thinking about animals and about conservation in Indigenous communities here in Canada anyway. So do you think it's fair to say, based on the theme of the book is that everything is connected? There is all of these connections.
Yes, absolutely. And I think conservation has shifted, hasn't it, from this kind of species first approach, which would have been epitomised by something like the giant panda being the icon for the World Wildlife Foundation. But yeah, definitely moved to more of an ecological approach where it's not just the animal, but it's the entire habitat. And nature has spun this phenomenally tangled web of connection. Everything is built on kind of overlapping and interconnectedness. And so it's kind of baffling to think that we have this idea that we can just, remove a species and everything will be fine. And we can, knock out these links in this web and there won't be any consequences. And we're seeing more and more evidence, I think, now of the consequences. What happens when we remove the apex predators from a landscape? Well, crap happens because all of these other animals are not being controlled anymore, and we've really like destabilized the balance of the system. Look to India and the vulture crisis that they have gone through. They've lost tens of millions of vultures, and I go into that more in the book, and the cause of that being a very simple cause, the use of a cheap anti-inflammatory drug in cattle. Without those vultures, which did the job of scavenging and removing carrion for free and extremely effectively, we're now seeing the knock-on effects of actual loss of human life, an increase in about 100,000 extra deaths per year because of poor hygiene and water contamination because of a lot of these birds. And we're seeing more and more of it. So yeah, absolutely, everything is connected. And I think we have this idea of a species value based on what does for us, and we're not seeing what it does and how it functions within that ecological system, because we can't help but come at it from a very human-centric way of thinking, and I think that's changing, but historically that's always been the way that we think about other animals.
So I think we're going to talk about some of the specific animals that you mentioned in the book. And I already said that I don't like mosquitoes. So let's start with mosquitoes. And a long time ago, when I lived in Thailand, I remember going to a mosquito museum in Chiang Mai in the north of Thailand. And it was basically the house of some people who had been scientists who'd studied mosquitoes. And inside they had lots and lots, thousands of dead mosquitoes pinned to boards. And they had butterflies and things as well. But I was amazed to learn how many different types of mosquito there are. And so it did slightly change my thinking about mosquitoes. So tell us about mosquitoes.
Yes, they're always the hardest one to advocate for. I like you, Zazie. I have a problematic relationship with mosquitoes because they adore me. So from this time of year, now we're seeing spring and we're seeing insects returning, and it's wonderful. But on the flip side, I'm seeing those little mozzies and the other bloodsuckers flying around, and I know that I'm just going to get them. Fortunately, we don't need to worry here in the UK about disease spread. But of course, in other parts of the world, mosquitoes are a massive factor in loss of life. So I think the latest WHO report had about over 600,000 deaths in 2024, which were caused by mosquito spread diseases. And malaria is the big one. And so it's in some ways very reasonable that mosquitoes come up as the animal that most people really hate and the animal that prompts the question, what's the point of it? And wouldn't the world be a better place if we eradicated mosquitoes? And what I want to do is just to add a little bit more nuance into it. And it's precisely for the reason that you've already said, that there are lots of different species of mosquito. There's about 3,500, and only, I think it's 2.5% of those are known to be vectors for diseases that impact humans. I think it's, there could be up to 10% which are implicated, but at the moment it's only a fraction that we know are really, really causal factors in spreading human disease. And that's not to sort of downplay that, because this is a catastrophic loss of life, but to say that we can't just wipe out mosquitoes and expect for there not to be any consequences, because they are also insects, and the planet is losing insects at an alarming rate. Of all of the animals, insect loss is one that we should all be really, really concerned about. Insects function as food for lots of other creatures. So if we want to keep seeing things like swifts, so in the UK, the return of swifts and swallows and other fly-catching insects back in spring is a huge thing. People love to see these birds, but they need flying insects, and mosquitoes will form a part of their diet. And it's the same with things like bats. Lots of species of insect and water animals, because mosquitoes develop as larvae in water. So things like dragonflies will be eating mosquitoes, and fish as well. So they're kind of at the base of a lot of food webs. For that reason alone, they're really important. But there's evidence that they might also have a pollinator function. It's not quite there, like in terms of how much we know about it. But one of the researchers that I spoke to creates these incredible high-res photos in macro of the mosquito species that he studies, and he's seen pollen grains attached to them, like even attached to their eyes, which is quite incredible. And so, there's a suggestion that maybe they also play a role in pollination, and we need to investigate that more. There's so much about them that we don't know. So while we need to control the species that are problematic because they spread serious diseases, we don't want to be throwing like all the babies out with the bathwater by thinking that we should be eradicating them all. And the other thing to say on malaria is that we also kind of need to be thinking about our role in this disease. It's a preventable disease. It's also a treatable disease. So the fact that 600,000 people are still dying every year, I mean, that's something that is also a socio-economic problem. And I don't think we can pin all of the blame on mosquitoes. We're living in an era where I just saw a headline today that said the number of billionaires on the planet is now going to rise to, I can't remember the figure, but yet there are hundreds of millions of people living in poverty, and those are the people who are being disproportionately impacted by these diseases. And so if we want to do something about that, then I think we also need to be looking at behaviour.
Yeah, I hear a lot of people in the north, where I work in northern Canada, so in the boreal forest in Canada, bringing up a lot, like they don't hear songbirds like they used to. When I was a kid, we used to hear so many more songbirds, and I know that there's, I guess everything is connected, and birds eat insects, and if insects are disappearing in these large numbers that they are, there's birds are not going to have enough to eat. So
yeah,
since
there's a lot of problems.
Yeah, for sure. So I think because you have that beautiful cover that Zazie held up with the wasp on it, we should ask about wasps. What do you say about wasps?
Yeah, probably. I don't know if they're up there, if they're equal for mosquitoes, for being sort of the most hated animal. Wasps. I have a personal stake in encouraging people to value wasps more, because both of my brothers are fully subscribe to the idea that there's no point to wasps, that the world would be a better place without wasps. They both kill them when they see them, and so I really have this goal that I need to convince, starting with them, I need to convince them of the worth of wasps. And again, it's this it's this thing where, like, if you say the word wasp to someone, then they're instantly going to think about the problematic species. They're going to think about the species that um, annoy them when they're having a picnic or when they're sitting in a beer garden. They're going to think about the stripy yellow and black, waspy wasp that um, is the one that is portrayed in all of the kind of popular media articles, wasps are invading. And it's such a small fraction of the overall number of wasp species. There's like 100,000 wasp species in the world. And a minority of them are the social species. But it's the social species that are the ones that are, well, the ones that cause friction with people. And that's simply for the reason that social species are living in a colony, they have division of labour, and the workers are going out and they're finding food and they're bringing it back to the nest, and they will defend that nest. So they kind of have a stake in making sure that nothing comes near that nest, and they're equipped to defend themselves. So, we come along and we're sort of blundering around and getting too close to the nest, and they're going to react to that. But most wasps are not social, they're solitary, and about half of all wasp species are parasitoid wasps, which is super cool. And they're really under the radar. So what they're doing is they're actually going out and hunting, but things like cockroaches, some of them, or spiders, or other insects, and they bring them back to their little nests, and they use them as like a living larder for their eggs. They'll lay an egg on one of these poor prey animals. They don't kill it; they paralyze it. So they inject an incredible form of venom, and venom is something that I also explore in the book in more detail, in the wasp chapter, but also in the snakes chapter, of course, because each animal has this incredible sort of cocktail of chemicals, which is so precisely targeted to achieve a particular ecological function. And so in these wasps, they can, for example, just paralyze a cockroach species, leave it living, lay their egg on it, seal up the burrow, and move on. And their air catches and basically sort of eats the cockroach alive, which is gruesome, absolutely. But it isn't something that we need to worry about. They're never going to do that to us. And if you look at like the ecological impacts of wasps as a whole, they're incredibly important for things like pest control. If we got rid of wasps, we would really notice it. They do this incredible service for us. Like I said, completely under the radar and for free. We've got the species in our gardens, which might be the social species, but they're going out and they're killing aphids or caterpillars of species that we might think are pests, like various sort of moth larvae and these sorts of things, which we don't want on our plants either. And the wasps are just removing them. And the economic benefits of wasps have been estimated to be huge. I can't remember the number completely off my head, but it's like hundreds of millions of dollars. So there are lots of reasons why we should be valuing them and sort of appreciating them for what they're doing. I think people have this idea that the wasps are out to get them, like they want to be annoying. And wasp brains are pretty sophisticated, but they're not that sophisticated. Like to harbour those kinds of intentions would require quite a lot of complex cognitive machinery. And there's no evidence that wasps can do that. And that sort of goes for the other animals as well. Like spiders aren't lurking there trying to get you. They're not stalking around because they want to scare you. Snakes even aren't doing that. So that's another kind of theme of the book, is that I want to show that, just because we come into contact with an animal doesn't mean that it's out to get us.
Then that probably leads very nicely to our next question, though, because we wanted to ask about sharks as well. And I think people often feel that sharks are definitely out to get people. And actually, at this time of year, we've had a few media stories of sharks being spotted off the western coast of North America, the US and Canada. And apparently that's just part of their kind of normal migration at this time of year. So tell us about sharks as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and absolutely, and there is evidence off the west coast. I think it's off the Californian coast, where sharks sort of have these nursery areas. So there would be lots of young ones, and was great whites, but it was definitely a species that could be predatory on humans. And we do have to remember that they are predators, and they are, top of their food chain. I mean, ish, although there are orcas who, I mean, there have been some reports of orcas who also attack. But, they're the ones in the ocean that are hunting everything, and they can very easily hunt us. And obviously they do. People do lose life to sharks. But what's kind of incredible is that researchers have looked, they've flown drones over, I think, to look at sort of potential coexistence of people and sharks in the same waters. And that's specifically in these kind of nursery areas. And they found that sharks of sort of 2 meters in length, which isn't as big as I get, but that's still pretty big, um, were frequently coexisting with surfers and stand-up paddleboarders and swimmers in these areas. And so if they were out to get us, there would be, so many attacks. So this was kind of like during the summer months when people were enjoying the waters off the Californian coast. And in this one particular study, I think there was one incident where someone reported like an interaction with a shark, but they didn't see what it was. So it was hard to know what it actually was, and it was not a serious one either. But it's that kind of evidence that shows that, like, a lot of the time we're overlapping in space and time with these animals, but clearly they're not out to get us, because they could very easily, a 2 meter long shark could very easily cause a lot of damage. Like I said, I don't want to downplay the fact that people do lose their lives to sharks, because each one of those is also a tragedy. Some of the theories about why sometimes I think a shark could be actually, viewing us as prey, and will attack. There's also a theory that it's kind of a mistaken identity. So, like, they see a shape at the surface, and there's some evidence that the view that a shark would have of a person from underneath is pretty similar to the outline shape of like a seal, or a sea lion. And so they investigate it, and their way of investigating it is biting. And so I don't want to say that sharks never have intention to attack people, but I do want to downplay that. I want to refute that they are swimming around, and out to get us at every opportunity.
I think one of the coolest sort of mental reframes that I've learned working with Indigenous people is this idea. And I know Zazie and I have talked about this before. I think I wrote a blog about it, but it's just that animals are making a living in the world. So when if I look at a wasp or something, that would be how it would be framed. Is it, oh, he stung me? Well, he's just, and they also gender animals, which I find kind of interesting too. So it wouldn't be like it is just making a living. It's like the wasp, he's just making a living in the world. I think that's an interesting way to look. Like sharks, even if they do eat people, they're just making a living in the world. They're not, like you're saying, that they're not doing it out of they're not like, it's not warfare. It's not, they're just doing what they need to do to stay alive. So with that in mind, do you think that some animals, just I think earlier you were talking about pandas, but do you think there's some animals that sort of are a little bit not overinflated, but get some warm fuzzies that, that maybe, we should share that with other animals? Are there animals that maybe get, a little bit of human attention that you feel maybe they don't deserve, or that should be spread in other directions?
Yes, for sure. So one of the chapters, the final chapter in my book, is looking at the animals that we love, the animals that we adore and that we support and champion and celebrate, and doing the exact same exercise and looking at what they're actually like as well. It's a little bit tongue in cheek, but my aim is to do exactly what you're saying, like to think about animals not as good or bad, but as animals, and they're out there and they're doing what they need to do to survive. And that means things like dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, which I loved as a child. I had a big poster of one on my wall, and it was leaping through the air and glistening. and it has that sort of benevolent look on its face that all dolphins do. Um, but dolphins aren't all cute and cuddly when when they're swimming around. They can be very aggressive to each other. Um, they Males will force copulation on females. Um, they engage in infanticide, so they kill babies. Like, there are lots of things about dolphins that we we wouldn't celebrate, but I think we overlook them, or maybe we don't know that these animals also exhibit behaviours that we wouldn't deem to be acceptable. And it's the same for things. I mean, sea otters are one of the worst, but they're cute and cuddly, and people think they're adorable. But they engage in all kinds of things. I don't know how. I mean, I don't know how much to go into things that make people go, "Mm, really? Like, that's not what I expected from these animals." And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that, like, these are mammals. We love mammals. I think that's partly physical. We like the animals that are a little bit like us, like front-facing eyes, um, cute, especially in their offspring. So, we have this inbuilt cuteness kind of response to animals that have the baby schema, which Conrad Lorenz came up with. That they got round heads and big eyes, and little nose and little mouth. So basically, a kitten. This sort of triggers this urge in us to want to nurture it, because biologically it triggers the same kinds of responses as it would be for our own babies, is the idea. So any animal that's got those kinds of features is already going to be prioritized. And animals that don't have those features, sadly, it takes a lot more work to try and appreciate them. And I guess, I mean, I don't know, like, a lot of your listeners will be dog lovers, of course, and cat lovers, but dogs, I mean, and I'm a huge dog lover, but they also are responsible for quite a lot of deaths. Um, I think the stats I saw was like 40,000 people lose their lives to dogs per year, which isn't something that I think feels very comfortable, because we love them. They're our best friends and they're our companions. But I think there's this difference in the way that we view that, in saying, oh, there must have been something wrong with that dog. It wasn't a normal dog, or didn't really mean it, or we sort of make excuses a little bit for their behaviour. And then um, people were killed by sharks in the same year, for example, because it's that few. Very few people. Sharks cause very few deaths, but those are the ones that are kind of sort of sensationalized in our minds as and feed into these fears. So I guess, yeah, I'm rambling a little bit, but it comes back to the message of the book, which is that I think we could just apply a little bit more consistency in the way that we're thinking about different animals. Mm-hmm.
It makes me think of koalas. Like, aren't they? I don't know if that's in your book or not, but they're presented to, I mean, people who are not in the koala zone as being almost like teddy bears, but I understand that that's not the case necessarily.
Yes, no, they're actually not in the book, but it is a good one. No, I've heard that they're quite vicious, and you wouldn't.
They're just making a living in the world.
Yeah, they are. But anything that's cute and cuddly, they're just ahead a few paces. Like, they're always going to be ahead. And so what I want to do is just bring up the rest. I don't want people to reduce what they're thinking. Don't stop being a fan of penguins and dolphins and even otters, but try and appreciate the others a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. I feel like for the dog bites, in some countries, rabies must play quite a big part in that as well, because especially I think in India, there are a lot of deaths from rabies, especially amongst children, which is very sad. So yeah, I feel like in researching this book, you've learned lots of really good things about some animals, which you might not have expected. And you found other things about animals, which, are not so positive at all. So which animal did you most enjoy writing about?
Yeah, it's a hard one, but I'm going to say vultures as a group. I really, really enjoyed researching vultures and getting to meet some vultures up close because prior to that point, I'd seen them in California, just wheeling like turkey vultures. They're the norm, just like wheeling above. And then I'd seen them in Africa, sort of doing that vulture thing where they just sort of hunched over in a tree and they're silhouetted or very vulturey or at a carcass. So typical vulturey. But I was very lucky to be able to go to a place in Wales, actually in the UK, where they breed vultures with the intention of releasing birds back into the wild. So I said earlier, vulture populations have crashed. So in Asia, the Indian subcontinent specifically, tens of millions of birds have been lost. And this actually relates to your point, Zazie, about feral dogs and rabies, because the loss of vultures means feral dog populations have increased, and there has been an increase in rabies cases as well as a result of that. So, um, so that's a huge problem in India and other countries, but in Africa they're also being persecuted for different reasons. So poisoning by livestock owners. Some of it is belief-based use as well, so using them in sort of traditional medicines. Kind of like as a group, they're undergoing some really huge losses, and I want people to care more about this. The fact that tens of millions of birds just died, and nobody, it didn't sort of become a monumental story for a lot of people. And lots of people aren't aware that this even happened. Kind of shows how little we value these birds, but they're so important to the health of ecosystems. They're so specialised in what they do. No other animal can clean up the environment like vultures do as a group. And more than that, as I found when I met them, they're really charismatic. They're they're fascinating birds, and they're curious, and they're playful, um, and they've got their individual personalities. And so, actually being able to see that made me become quite enamoured with these birds. And this was a couple of hooded vultures, some Cape Griffin vultures, and also some Andean condors that they had at the centre, which they're just phenomenal birds. It really changed me from being someone who thought, oh yeah, vultures are quite important because they eat carrion and that's important, to being like a fully fledged vulture advocate.
That sounds like a really cool experience. So, thank you for coming to tell us about your book. And towards the end of our interviews, we always like to ask our guests to recommend a book that they have read recently and loved. So, what have you been reading?
Oh, well, I haven't actually finished it, so I hope this is okay.
That's fine.
Okay, right. So I'm reading this book called The Animal in That Country by Laura Jean McKay. It's been out for a few years and I've been wanting to read it for ages. And so far, so good. I mean, I'm only about a quarter of the way through. But the premise is the main character is this sort of foul-mouthed alcoholic grandma. So it's set in Australia, and she works at this wildlife park. So she's one of the rangers there. And it sort of sets up her character as someone, just really got a few problems going on. But then this mysterious disease is spreading across Australia. And what it seems to be doing is allowing humans to understand animals, or allowing like animals to actually communicate with people. So it's kind of about that. I think she's just about to set off on a journey, potentially with a dingo, and it's well, I don't actually know yet because I'm not there. But from what I've read on the back, this disease where people can hear what animals are saying is making people go mad. So I'm really interested to know how it plays out and what the animals are saying, because I just think that's a really fascinating concept. And I sort of would love to know what animals are saying, but I also think, yeah, I don't know. Don't know if I would want to know what they were saying. Anyway, I'm loving it so far. So I think it will
Cool.
be good.
Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting concept, and I think that will intrigue a lot of our listeners too. So, thank you so much for telling us about your book today. I'm going to ask you to hold up the cover one more time just so that we can all see that beautiful wasp again. So, Beauty of the Beasts, Rethinking Nature's Least Loved Animals is out now and available wherever books are sold. If people want to know more about you, Jo, where do they go?
I would say Instagram is probably where I'm most active. I have a website, which is just jowimpenny.com. I post various things on Instagram. Yeah, I'm in a bit of a transition phase in terms of my social media because I abandoned Twitter, which I used to do most of my stuff on. But yeah, so I'm still sort of trying to figure out where.
I think a lot of us have been through that transition
Yeah.
sooner or later. So I will put a link to your Instagram and your website in the show notes, and of course to your publisher's page about the book. And thank you to everyone who's listening today. We would like to know if this has reframed how you think about any animals and which animals make you especially squeamish. If you're listening, you can leave us a voicemail to tell us. And if you're watching on YouTube, please let us know in the comments. And today, I'd also like to give a special shout out to our listeners in Auckland, New Zealand. Thank you for being with us today, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us and being part of this community. We love having you with us. And yeah, we will see you next time. Thank you, Jo, for joining us. And bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Positive Posting Conversation. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the show and write us a review via your podcast app. For the show notes, visit companionanimalpsychology.com. This show was produced by Zazie Todd. The music is Melody from Paris by Studio Le Bousse. See you next time.